Fire chargers are Blade here, and in this video I will be reacting to the Exodus Pharaoh Explained uploaded by Expedition Bible on April 28th of this year. It has about 673,000 views and 30,000 likes. In order to prevent this reaction from becoming unreasonably long, I will keep my commentary to a minimum. And also I won't get overly emotional, and I will not attack the creator of this video. So let's get going.
Hi everyone, I just got back from a long trip to Egypt, and I was going to the sites that have to do with the biblical event of the Exodus. Archaeology is the study of the ancient people from what they've left behind, and one thing that the pharaohs have left behind is themselves in their mummified remains. And so you go into the museum, into the royal mummy room, and here are the pharaohs of old. I'm used to looking at pottery that dates to the time of a king. It's really intriguing when you're looking at the kings themselves.
That's almost a minute of useless.
Of these royal mummies, which one was the Pharaoh of the Exodus? And this is hotly debated to this day. But here's the thing. If you just follow what the Bible says, if you just follow the evidence, then the answer to this question is actually straightforward and clear.
Cool logo. I wish I knew how to do this kind of stuff, but I don't.
Don't forget to hit that subscription button.
Wait, how are they... Serious question, how are they able to put, like, these objects floating in the video? How do you do that?
And I wanted to thank everybody that's been leaving comments in the video comment section about my book. I appreciate that very much, and I will leave a link in the description where you can order a copy of my book, Where God Came Down the Archaeological Evidence. Okay, so if we're going to talk about the Pharaoh of the Exodus, then we need to talk about the historian Manetho, because he's an extra biblical source for the Exodus. Now, the writings of Manetho are lost to us, except through the quotes from later writers. And the earliest of those writers is the first century Jewish historian Josephus. This is the complete works of Josephus. And in it, Josephus wrote that one of Egypt's principal writers was Manetho, who was by birth an Egyptian. He wrote a history of his own country in the Greek tongue, out of their sacred records. Josephus says of Manetho, "I will set down his very words as if I were to bring the very man himself into a court for a witness." Okay, so what Josephus is saying here is that the AD first century historian Josephus is directly quoting.
You have all sorts of cool computer graphics. Why are you using a whiteboard?
The earlier 3rd century BC historian Manetho, who has written a history of Egypt using these much earlier Egyptian records. There's no doubt that Manetho wrote about the Israelites because he described a people whose leader was called Moses, who were captives in Egypt, but when they went out of that country, they built a city in Judea and called it Jerusalem. Then Manetho says that these people took their journey from Egypt during the reign of Amenephis, the king of Egypt.
There are like 4 variants of Manetho, and each one names like a different pharaoh or something. And Josephus himself contradicts his quote from Manetho. He says it was a different pharaoh named Thutmose, and this king Amenephis didn't even exist. That's what he says.
Amenephis is the Greek form of the Egyptian name Amenhotep. So in Josephus, we are given a quote from Manetho where he names the Pharaoh of the Exodus. This is huge. Josephus doesn't know the name Amenhotep. He only knows it because he's quoting Manetho. And Manetho knows the name Amenhotep because he has access to these early Egyptian records. So the name Amenhotep, the Pharaoh of the Exodus, is coming from these earlier records and being recorded in the history of Egypt written by Manetho in the 3rd century BC, and then quoted in AD 1st century by the historian Josephus. This is an incredible source that lets us know the name of the Exodus Pharaoh.
Good.
In Egypt,
This video
I
is
met up
still
with
the
one of my
majority
good
of
friends
my
and
content.
colleagues, archaeologist Dr. Titus Kennedy, and one of the sites that we traveled to was the ancient site of Heliopolis. This is where Manetho served as a priest and where he wrote his history of Egypt.
We're here at Heliopolis, the city of the sun. This city is important for many reasons, but one of those is that there was a priest here who lived in the 4th and 3rd century BC named Manetho, who was one of the foremost historians for ancient Egypt. And in his writings, Manetho tells us that the Pharaoh of the Exodus was someone named Amenhotep.
You already said all of this in this.
Pharaohs that are named Amenhotep are found in the 18th dynasty, and so in the 18th dynasty, you have Amenhotep the first, second, third, etc. And so which one of these is the one that Manetho is referring to? And the best way to figure this out is to use the biblical date of the Exodus, which is found in 1 Kings 6:1. 1 Kings 6:1 says, in the 480th year after the Israelites came out of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of...
Yeah, the issue with using this for chronology is that it assumes that this is trying to provide a literal account. Now, ancient Near Eastern temple dedication inscriptions often say that the temple dedication was XYZ years after a certain past event, and that XYZ in all of them is never the exact number of years that have passed since that event. And also 480 would be numerologically significant, as 40 times 12, yada yada yada.
Ziv, the second month, he began to build the temple of the Lord. So there's 480 years between these two events, when the Israelites came out of Egypt, the Exodus, and the 4th year of Solomon's reign. It's very well established that the 4th year of Solomon's reign is 966 BC. So to get the date of the Exodus, all we have to do is add 480 years to 966 BC, and we get 1446 BC, which is...
I already explained this earlier, like in the last 2 minutes. There are issues with this.
Is the biblical date of the Exodus.
That's not even a date, that's a year. A date has 3 parts: year, month, and day.
We can turn our attention back to the Egyptian chronology, and we can ask the simple question: is there a pharaoh named Amenhotep that is reigning during the biblical date 1446 BC? Amenhotep...
Spoiler alert, the answer is no. Even if it was there a pharaoh named Amenhotep who was alive during 1446 BC, the answer is still no.
Amenhotep I reigned from 1546 to 1526.
This is off by over 20 years. It's actually like 1524 to 1504 BC.
His reign is too early. Amenhotep III reigned too late, from 1414 to 1377 BC.
Okay, I assume that this part was a typo because 1414 to 1377 BC is not 30 years. And also, this date is wrong. Amenhotep III reigned from 1389 to 1351 BC.
In between them, Amenhotep II reigned from 1450 to 1423.
No, he didn't. He reigned from around 1426 to 1400 BC, give or take a year. And that means that the earliest he could have been born was around 1445 BC.
So the biblical date of 1446 BC for the Exodus falls within the reign of Amenhotep II.
No, it does not.
The Amenhotep that Manetho is writing about must be Amenhotep II, because
How?
the dates of his reign are in sync with the biblical date of the Exodus.
No, it is not. I already told you.
There's additional information from other verses in the Bible that can also be used to further test Amenhotep II. For example, in Exodus, it talks about the Pharaoh that reigns before the Exodus Pharaoh, and he is often referred to as the Pharaoh of the oppression. In the book of Exodus, we are told this: Pharaoh tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian. During that long period, the king of Egypt died, for the Lord had said to
Emphasis on during that long period, not for
Moses and Midian, go back to Egypt.
for all those who wanted to kill you are dead.
In the New Testament, in Acts chapter 7, Stephen is retelling how Moses fled to Midian, but then after 40 years had passed, he returned to Egypt. We can test this then with Amenhotep II. Did the predecessor
Like, no such requirement exists here.
of Amenhotep II reign for more than 40 years? Well, his predecessor was his father, Thutmose III.
That's not how it's pronounced.
And Thutmose III had a reign of 54 years.
And 1446 BC was one of those years. Also, he reigned from, 1470, around 1477 to 1423 BC, to 1478 to 1424 BC.
He's the only pharaoh in the 18th dynasty that had a reign for more than 40 years.
And 1446 BC is one of those years. Amenhotep II wasn't even born then.
So, Amenhotep II passes this test.
That's not a real test.
Exodus 11:5 says of the 10th plague that every firstborn son in Egypt will die,
Good.
including the firstborn son
The content
Pharaoh,
of the original
who sits
video is
on
still
the
a
throne.
majority of my
If
reaction time.
Amenhotep II passes this test. Exodus 11:5 says of the 10th plague that every firstborn son in Egypt will die, including the firstborn son of Pharaoh, who sits on the throne. If Amenhotep II is the Exodus Pharaoh, then his firstborn son should have died in the 10th plague. And so the successor of Amenhotep II is his son, Thutmose IV, who is
Again, the pronunciation.
not his firstborn son. His firstborn son died mysteriously, we know from the Egyptian records.
And as playing, this shouldn't take long. See, if there's multiple ads, pushing, and as soon as the skip button pushes, it automatically skips all the remaining
His firstborn
ads.
son died mysteriously, we know from the Egyptian records.
This is the Great Sphinx at Giza. Between the paws of the Sphinx is what's called the Sphinx Dream Stele. This was commissioned by Pharaoh Thutmose IV. He told a story
Again, the pronunciation.
about he came down to the Sphinx, he took a nap, and while he was sleeping, the gods came to him in a dream, and they promised to him that he would become the next pharaoh. This was strange because he had an older brother who was the crown prince, but this older brother had mysteriously died and disappeared from history. This was propaganda. He used the gods to give him divine legitimacy when he wasn't expected to become the next pharaoh.
So we have Amenhotep II passing these tests, these biblical criteria, because his predecessor reigned for over 40 years.
Again, that's not a real requirement, and even if it was, 1446 BC is one of those years.
And the one who succeeded him to the throne was not his firstborn.
And if the middle test is a real one, then Amenhotep II fails it because he didn't ascend until 1426 or 1425 BC, around the tail end of October. If it was 1426 BC, it would have been October 31st. If it was 1425 BC, it would have been October 30th, because the Egyptian calendar at this point didn't have intercalation.
Next, we travel deep into the region of the Delta, to the ancient site of Avaris. One of the main excavators
Again, the pronunciation
of Avaris is the Austrian archaeologist Manfred Vitok, and he's the one that excavated the 18th dynasty palace there.
So we are here at Avaris, and this is where the palace of Amenhotep II
was discovered and excavated.
Yeah, starts in that corner essentially. Yeah, and then comes over like this.
So we're just out in an agricultural field right here. This is all that's left. We can see pottery around. We can see a few foundation stones around, but this is where the 18th dynasty palace stood. In this field underneath our feet and behind me.
I'll pause it and my recording for a while. Okay, I'm back.
But this is a palace that has been discovered, and this is a palace that has been excavated. How long have they been excavating in this area?
About 60 years.
And yet there's like nothing hardly to see here. It's just all been turned back into agricultural fields.
Yeah, mostly pottery and maps.
BTOC reported that the archaeology demonstrated that the occupation of this palace covers the time from Amos to Amenhotep II.
It's Ahmose. It's not pronounced Amos. That's not even close.
This palace complex was occupied through the reign of Thutmose III and Amenhotep
Again, the pronunciation.
II when it was suddenly and mysteriously abandoned.
So
Then it was resettled by Amenhotep III. And also, it wasn't the Israelites who were living in the palace district.
excavations at the 18th dynasty palace in Avaris provided then
Again, pronunciation.
archaeological evidence to support Amenhotep II as the Exodus Pharaoh.
Again, the Israelites weren't living at the palace district. It was native ethnic Egyptians lived at the palace district.
Hey parents, do you know how your kids are being taught American
Another
history in the
ad.
schools?
Luckily,
Here in this book on page
skips them all.
326.
Amenhotep II as the Exodus Pharaoh.
It's this cool statue.
One of the most impressive pharaohs in all of Egyptian history is the pharaoh Ramses II. And so it was very early on that Egyptologists started to propose that Ramses II must have some connection with the Exodus. I am here at
Yeah, and his city, which didn't exist until either his reign or shortly earlier, is mentioned in the book of Exodus.
Memphis. This is the first capital of Egypt, and below me is this colossal statue of Ramses II, who built this site up during his reign. Now, the biggest problem with Ramses II being the Exodus Pharaoh is time, because Ramses II did not start his reign until 1279 BC. So this is 167 years later than 1446 BC.
And Amenhotep II started his reign 20 years later than 1446 BC. And he started his life about 1 or 2 years later than 1446 BC.
Which is the biblical date for the Exodus.
Again, that's just a year, not a date. And also, this assumes an over-literalist reading, which might not be the author's intention.
And remember that the predecessor to the Exodus Pharaoh has to have a reign of more than 40 years.
That's not a real requirement.
Predecessor of Ramses II is Seti I, and he reigned from 1290 to 1279 BC, which is just a reign of 11 years. So he fails the test.
That's not a real test.
Now, Ramses II does have a very long reign of 66 years, and so is he the pharaoh of the oppression. Well, the problem here is that would make his successor, Merneptah, the pharaoh of the Exodus, and the Exodus pharaoh can't have their firstborn son inherit their throne because he would have died in the 10th plague. The successor to Merneptah is Seti II, and he is his firstborn son. So the reason that Ramses II can't be connected to the Exodus is because he fails all these tests.
This isn't a real test.
If he failed just...
And this might not be a real test because the meaning of the numbers might not be literal, and if it is a real test, then Amenhotep II also fails.
one of these criteria...
Oh, and this is just a bait and switch. They used this X for Merneptah, but now are baiting and switching it to Ramses II. And if you're wondering, Ramses II, what successor Merneptah was his 13th son.
then he would be disqualified as a candidate, but he fails on all counts.
Well, one of those accounts he objectively does not fail on. Another count you just made up. That's not a real test requirement. And on another one, that might not be a real requirement. And if it is one, then Amenhotep II also fails.
So now I'm going to give my general views of the debate that's been going on for a long time between the early date and the late date. The early date for the Exodus is in the 15th century BC. The late date is in the 13th century BC. And this is Amenhotep II versus Ramses II as Pharaoh of the Exodus. The main verse that's used for the late date is Exodus 1:11. And here we have the Israelites under slave masters who build a store city named Ramses. And so the idea is that this city named Ramses is connected to the Pharaoh Ramses II, and therefore the Exodus must date to his time.
Avaris was established in the 12th dynasty, but in the 19th dynasty to the north, a new city and palace emerged called P-Ramses. Now in the book of Exodus, we see that one of the store cities that's built is called Ramses. Some have explained this as scribal updating later on, but
There's no way it's that. The city of Ramses did not exist in any fashion prior to the 19th dynasty, as this person admitted just a few seconds earlier.
there's a possibility that this area was also called Ramses during the 18th dynasty.
No, there isn't. The name Ramses did not exist in any fashion prior to the time of Ramses I's life. He's the first attested use of the name Ramses in any fashion.
It's important to understand that Exodus 1:11 is not in conflict with the early date. So even
Yes,
if
it is.
the name Ramses is a late name for the city, it's still not a problem.
It's not a late name for the city. The city didn't exist in any fashion before 1300 BC.
For the early date, because sometimes the Bible uses later names for cities in place of earlier ones. A good example.
There is no possibility for retrojection or redaction here. The city of Ramses did not exist in any fashion until 1300 BC around.
Of this is the city of Dan.
One simple but brilliant trick
More
to cool
ads.
your home in 90 seconds. Tired of hot and stuffy rooms during summer?
Your names for cities in place of earlier ones. A good example of this is the
Just
city
auto
of Dan.
rewinds for a
In
few
Judges
seconds
18, we have
after I
the
skip the ad.
Danites capture and rebuild a city, and then they name it Dan after their ancestor, though it had formerly been called Laish. Then we can go back in time, all the way back to Genesis 14:14, which tells us that Abram went as far as Dan. So here we have a clear example of the later name for the city Dan, replacing the earlier name Laish. And this is done because the Israelites were more familiar with the name Dan. And so this is what may be going on in Exodus 1:11,
It certainly
where we
isn't.
have possibly the later name for the city, Ramses, being used instead of the earlier name.
There was no earlier name. The city of Ramses didn't exist in any fashion before 1300 BC.
As we wouldn't date Abram using the name of the city Dan in Genesis 14:14, so we shouldn't date the Exodus by the name of the city Ramses in Exodus 1:11.
Why?
The main verse, as we've already covered for the early date, is 1 Kings 6:1. This is a real problem for the late date. And so the way that they argue against 1 Kings 6:1 is they say that the 480 years that's mentioned there shouldn't be taken literally. It's not a literal number. What this is really talking about, they argue, is 12 generations of 40 years. But then they say 40 years is too long for a generation. It really should be 25 years. Well, 12 times 25 is 300 years. So if you reduce 480 years in 1 Kings 6:1 down to 300 years, then you've moved the whole chronology 180 years later in time, and then it fits the reign of Ramses II. Before the late date theory,
I think the Britannica article on the Exodus or related topics mentioned something similar to that.
came along, nobody read 1 Kings 6:1 and read 480 years and said, oh, I get it, that really means 300 years. This is a reinterpretation of this verse, and it's agenda driven. So what's the agenda?
No, it isn't.
The agenda is to make Ramses II the Pharaoh of the Exodus.
There's no agenda whatsoever.
Now, there's another problem with the late date with Judges 11:26. So in Judges 11:26, we have Jephthah, who says for 300 years, Israel has occupied the land east of the Jordan. This took place around 1100 BC. When you add 300 years to 1100 BC, you get 1400 BC.
Yeah, it just records Jephthah's claim without saying that he was right or not.
Add the 40 years of wilderness wandering, and then you get this mid-15th century BC date for the Exodus, which is in agreement with the mid-15th century date of the Exodus from 1 Kings 6:1. So since Judges 11:26 also gives a 15th century BC date for the Exodus, then
it doesn't really.
The late date scholars have to present their arguments against it. So what they say is that Jephthah is unreliable. And the reason that they give is that he calls in verse 24 the name of the Ammonite god Chemosh, whereas later in the Bible, for example, in 1 Kings 11:5, the name of the Ammonite god is given as Moloch. So Jephthah can't be trusted. He gives the wrong name of the god of the Ammonites, and so therefore in verse 26, when he says this 300 years, you can't trust that 300 years as being accurate. Well, this is actually from Jephthah, very important information about the Ammonites. He's telling us that earlier in their history they worshipped the god Chemosh, which makes sense because that's the god that the Moabites worship, and the Ammonites and the Moabites are brother nations that come from Lot. And so they worshipped early in their history Chemosh, and then later they changed and adopted, for whatever reason, the worship of the Amorite god Moloch.
No reason to think that.
Historically, nations sometimes change their gods. A few examples of this is Babylon. Babylon changed their god. Nebuchadnezzar worshipped Marduk, and then Nabonidus led the people to worship the god Sin. Egypt changed its god during the reign of Akhenaten, and the Israelite prophets are almost constantly rebuking the Israelites for changing their god, right? Because they've forsaken their God who delivered them out of Egypt and are worshiping these other gods. So this is not any kind of proof that Jephthah is being unreliable when he gives us the number 300. And again, these two verses, 1 Kings 6:1 and Judges 11:26, complement each other. They confirm each other. It's very powerful evidence. And this is the same argument that these scholars use against Acts chapter 7 and the testimony of Stephen. He's unreliable, he's untrustworthy. They need to say this because Stephen gives information that contradicts Ramses II as being the Pharaoh of the Exodus, because he says that Moses returns to Egypt after 40 years had passed, which means that the predecessor, as we've looked at already, of the Exodus Pharaoh needs to have reigned for more than 40 years.
No, it doesn't.
And the predecessor for Ramses II only reigned for 11 years. So they say the same thing.
It's still the majority, but I didn't pass it.
Unreliable, it can't be trusted.
No,
and that's just simply not the case. So Manetho is a big problem for the late date. Because he doesn't name Ramses as the Pharaoh of the Exodus, he names Amenhotep.
There are 4 variations, and each one names a different pharaoh.
So guess what the late date scholars say about Manetho? You guessed it, he's unreliable. And so the argument that they use against him is that there's these variants. Now, of course, for many ancient sources and ancient texts, there's later variants. That's why we have textual criticism, which is identifying those variants and trying to get as close as possible to the original. The general understanding for ancient texts is the earlier texts are usually considered more reliable than the later ones. And so of all the historians that quote Manetho, by far the earliest is Josephus, and everything that we've covered comes directly out of Josephus. The other problem with Manetho being unreliable is that to this day, the framework for the history, laying out the history of ancient Egypt, with these 30 dynasties that ruled over Egypt, that all comes from Manetho. And so it really doesn't work just to write Manetho off as being unreliable. And in addition to all of this, we have the archaeology from Avaris, which shows that the 18th dynasty palace came to an end during the reign of Amenhotep II. The palace of the 19th dynasty in P. Ramses didn't start with Ramses II,
Yes,
nor did it end after his reign. Really, the reality is that the evidence for the date and the Pharaoh of the Exodus is stacked on the early date side.
You didn't even give a date. Is this the end of the video?
This is the mummy of Amenhotep II, and the evidence is clear that he was the Pharaoh of the Exodus.
No, it isn't.
What is the archaeological evidence for the Exodus? Well, here's something. The mummy of Amenhotep II. According to the evidence, when you're looking at the mummy of Amenhotep II, you're looking at the very man who dealt with Moses, who hardened his heart and wouldn't let God's people go, who went through the 10 plagues. This is the Pharaoh whom God delivered his people from. So don't forget to hit that subscribe button.
Now
I'll
are
leave
you
a
done?
link in the description where you can order a copy of my book. You can watch other videos that we produced here. And thanks for watching. I'll catch you next time.
So now their video's done. So that's it. How do I end this? By the way, I'm currently working on a project that's a review of the first Patterns of Evidence film. So far I've gotten 40 minutes through it. So good, I kept my main goal of keeping my commentary short enough so that the original video still ends up being the majority of my reaction video's length.